With this being the second episode of Thicker Than Blood History, I think we can officially be called a series now. I had an excellent response from the first episode. Thank you for that. But now we move on to episode 2. It's the story of one of my wife's ancestors, but I do need to insert an asterisk here because there is some discrepancy in the line of pedigree, which often happens in genealogy research. It's nothing new. So it's my wife's ancestor, probably, but nonetheless, it's an awesome story. And this podcast serves to tell stories first. The genealogy aspect is more of a means to an end. It's how I discover the content, you could say. I'm also hoping this episode sounds a little crisper than the previous one. I'm still attempting to master the art of speaking into the microphone, as well as sound editing and story composition. Ironically, the content is the easy part. And fortunately, this next story has a lot of really good content. I had some difficulty in deciding which information to leave on the editing room floor, if you will, for the sake of time. This episode tells the story of a man who, in his search for paradise, finds himself quite literally swept up by fate and forever part of 2 or maybe even 3 of the most famous events in human history. He does find paradise, or rather, it finds him, but not even such a place can spare him the bitter pain of death. Death, you'll find, as it is with much of human history, remains always on the heels of our subject in this episode titled Mutiny in Paradise. I have felt lately as if mankind's space exploration is at a watershed moment, at least in terms of who's doing the exploring. You see, NASA may have broken the ice, but now, with some of the private enterprises we have getting in on it, enter capitalism, stage left. And if we play this out where this is going, say, I don't know, another 100 years, it could get interesting. And if we toss in a few variables, let's say our planet's feeling a bit overcrowded, putting stress on national governments, leaving them, maybe some of them, a little unstable. The various political groups ebb and flow, leaving people feeling persecuted, depending on who's in power. And those born into the bottom of the socioeconomic structures are, let's say, they're stuck there in perpetuity. And during all of this, some of the massive corporate enterprises, for fun, we'll call them Amazon, Google, and Apple, have discovered Mars is rich in natural resources. And they're willing to finance expedition groups of brave souls who might be willing to take the 3-month voyage through space and establish colonies and, of course, export resources. The hazards would be a major turnoff for most people, I think. It's uncharted territory for one, and people are always afraid of the unknown. The climate is harsh, and, oh yeah, by the way, there's a strange native species that wanders the Martian wilderness that, on a good day, may help you survive. But on a bad day, they might slaughter your entire colony. For most people, this deal would probably be a hard pass. What sort of person would sign up for this, right? I'm not sure I would. But some people would. Maybe someone who has nothing to lose. Maybe somebody who's desperate perhaps to start a new life. Start fresh without any baggage from Earth. Maybe somebody might see it as a way to break out of their social class. Maybe it's a new beginning for them and their family. It may be a chance to escape persecution for your beliefs, or it may be a chance to get rich. Or maybe it's a chance for some to build a new world, a paradise. That is, if you survive. In the early 17th century, the chance for a new beginning wasn't another planet, but it may as well have been. The decision for colonists during this time to leave the old world and settle in the new seems so illogical to me, considering the odds, that I've never been able to completely wrap my mind around the decision-making process. So putting it in the context of near future space travel, it helps me grasp it a bit. The subject of this podcast not only has the distinction of being one of those marginalized adventurers, but was twice a traveler to the New World and helped found 2 of the most famous colonies in history. He even inspired one of Shakespeare's plays. In 1606, the London Company was formed and granted permission by King James I to establish trading colonies in New England. The company was financed by businessmen who believed the New World to be rich in gold and silver. And after about a year of organizing, they recruited roughly 100 men who were either brave or crazy or desperate or some mix of all three to set sail and establish a colony that would soon to become known as Jamestown. Its location in the Chesapeake Bay was decided on for two reasons. Number one, it was an easily defensible location at the beginning of the Chesapeake Bay. And number two, it was unoccupied by any of the Native Americans at the time. Primarily because it was so swampy, so sandy, and the water was brackish that you couldn't drink it, and it was hopelessly infested with mosquitoes. And it didn't help anything that the adventurers brought little in the way of practical tools and provisions. Mostly they were concerned with finding gold, and thus this is the equipment that was given priority. They were not the sort that took easily to physical labor either. Their plan was to trade with the Indians for whatever provisions they lacked, like food. So now, here you and I, we look at this setup in Jamestown, and we can sit back and shake our heads at their stupidity. Just lots of bad decisions being made, and fair enough. But unfortunately for these people in Jamestown, history has a way of compounding bad decisions. It's a reoccurring theme, really. So, as fate would have it, these ill-equipped explorers happened to found Jamestown during the worst drought the area had seen in almost 1,000 years. This has been proven by studying tree rings on borings from bald cypress trees, which apparently live around 1,000 years. Long story short, Jamestown was a complete disaster, with 80% of the original group dying from disease and starvation. Some of the survivors defected to the Indians. The Powhatan tribe was the local tribe. For those who remained, death was just a harsh cough away, and venturing outside the tiny little triangle-shaped fort meant certain death by an Indian arrow. Oh, and by the way, the Powhatans, the Native American tribe that surrounded the fort, it's estimated that they numbered about 14,000 strong in the surrounding area, compared to barely 20 starved and diseased Englishmen. So those are fun odds. What was left of the survivors were brought some relief by a second supply the next year. Men and provisions arrived along with a stern warning letter from the investors demanding their profits from the expedition. And I remember reading about this letter that came from the London Company investors demanding their return on investment just after I had read about one of the Jamestown settlers boiling his boot leather to make it as edible as possible. And could you imagine at that moment eating your own boot so that you don't starve to death? And hearing that an investor on the other side of the Atlantic wants to know where his money is, it just must have been quite a moment. In 1609, it became evident that a third supply was going to be needed to get the colony back on its feet again, and so the London Company investors began recruiting more eager desperates wherever they could find them. And sometimes when you need volunteers, there's no better place to start than your local church. That is where they found my wife's ancestor, Stephen Hopkins. He was a minister's clerk. He was about 30 years old at the time. And he was described as, quote, a fellow who had much knowledge in the scriptures and could reason well therein, end quote. Stephen Hopkins was apparently made an offer he couldn't refuse, an offer of indentured servitude in exchange for free transportation, lodging, food, and 10 shillings every 3 months for his family, which included his wife Mary and 3 small children. And this would go on for 3 years, after which he was to receive 30 acres in the new colony. And so back to my original metaphor about traveling to Mars. What would get you to do that? And in Stephen's case, it's land, it's money, and it's a future for him and his family. I spent some time dwelling on the goodbye during this time for Stephen and his wife and his kids. It must have been emotional. Something like, don't worry, honey, after 3 years I'll come back and I'll bring you and kids to the little piece of paradise that I've carved out just for us. It's a tough goodbye. On June 2nd, 1609, Stephen Hopkins boarded the Sea Venture, which was the flagship in a big flotilla of 7 ships in all headed for Jamestown. On the Sea Venture with Stephen was a newly appointed governor of Jamestown, Sir Thomas Gates, who was charged with reestablishing order and finally bringing some profits from the failing colony. Margaret Hodges, author of Hopkins of the Mayflower, describes the first few weeks of the flotilla's voyage across the Atlantic. Quote, "For 7 weeks, the ships stayed within sight of each other, often within earshot, and the captains called to one another by way of trumpets. On the Sea Venture, all was peaceful. Morning and evening, Chaplain Buck and Clerk Hopkins gathered the passengers and crew on the deck for prayers and the singing of psalm." End quote. But when the flotilla was within about a week left of their voyage, their fortunes turned, and we have a primary source for the following events. Aboard the Sea Venture was an author named William Strachey, who kept a detailed journal. And he writes, quote, "On St. James Day, being Monday, the clouds gathering thick upon us, and the wind singing and whistling most unusually, a dreadful storm and hideous began to blow out from the northeast, which swelling and roaring as it were by fits, at length did beat all night from heaven, which like a hell of darkness turned black upon us. 24 hours the storm in a restless tumult had blown so exceedingly as we could not apprehend in our imaginations any possibility of greater violence. Yet did we still find it not only more terrible but more constant, fury added to fury, and one storm urging a second more outrageous than the former. It could not be said to rain. The waters, like whole rivers, did flood in the air. Winds and seas were as mad as fury and rage could make them. Howbeit this was not all. It pleased God to bring greater affliction yet upon us. For in the beginning of the storm we had received likewise a mighty leak." End quote. It almost sounds like they got hit by a hurricane, doesn't it? They get hit by a storm, and then they pass through the eye, and they get hit again. And after the second storm passes, the sea's calm. The rest of the flotilla, though, is nowhere in sight, and the Sea Venture is taking on water fast. For 4 days and nights, each man working together, pumping and bailing out water out of the lower levels as fast as they could. They jettison the cannons that are weighing the Sea Venture down, and they try and repair the leaks, but in the end it was hopeless. The ship was still sinking, and after 4 days the men were utterly exhausted. Another chronicler aboard the doomed vessel, a man named Sylvester Jourdain, recounts the moment that the men gave up all hope and accepted their fate. He says, quote, "Having some good and comfortable waters in the ship, fetched them and drunk them one to the other, taking their last leave of the other, until their more joyful and happy meeting in a more blessed world." End quote. What an incredibly intimate moment this is that's been preserved for us. Certain death is upon these men, and when they realize that all hope is gone, they open up what bottles of alcohol they have left, and they toast their goodbyes, one to the other, hoping that they meet again in paradise. But then suddenly there's a crash, and the Sea Venture comes to a splintering halt, and the hull collapses, and water rushes in, but the boat stops sinking. The Sea Venture had lodged itself onto a reef, and through the misty sea air they could make out a shoreline in the distance that some judged to be a little-known island called the Isle of Devils. And with that, 150 men and one dog swam, rafted, and floated themselves in what supplies they could tow to dry land. Stephen Hopkins used a barrel of wine to float himself to shore, a man after my own heart. And as the men explored their new temporary home, they discovered it to be far from an Isle of Devils. It was something more pleasant, something a little more like paradise. It was, in fact, modern-day Bermuda. And here they were wanting for nothing. The island was completely uninhabited. They built shelters from the wood of the cedar trees, and they had plenty of fowl to hunt and fish to catch. The salty sea breeze and the warm air made for a beautiful climate, too. And it turns out that much of the Sea Venture was still salvageable as well. Governor Gates ordered that it be disassembled, rebuilt, and reinforced with the native wood into 2 new vessels for the men to complete their ultimate mission of getting to Jamestown. But not everybody was on board with this plan. They had already sent out a small boat to seek help from Jamestown, and they never heard from those guys again. And some of the men who had been to Jamestown for previous excursions, they were a little leery. They were telling of the misery of the colony, the arrows of the Powhatan, the disease, the hunger. And for our Stephen Hopkins, weighing his choices ahead of him, he began to emerge as one of the chief dissenters among the group. William Strachey notes that Stephen had the ear of 2 of his comrades and made the following argument, quote, It was no breach of honesty, conscience, or religion to decline from the obedience of the governor, or to refuse to go any further led by his authority, except it so pleased themselves, since the authority ceased when the wreck was committed, and with it they were all then freed from the government of any man. There were two apparent reasons to stay them even in this place. First, the abundance of God's providence of all manner of good food, and next, some hope in reasonable time, when they might grow weary of the place, to build a small bark, that so might get clear from hence at their own pleasures. When in Virginia, the first would be assuredly wanting, and they might well fear to be detained in that country by the authority of the commander thereof, and their whole life to serve the turns of the adventurers with their travails and labors. End quote. So Stephen is basically saying to these two guys that this place has everything we need and then some, and we should stay here. The voyage is lost. Our oaths are no more. But the two men turned him into Governor Gates, who had him immediately arrested and brought to trial, where he faced the prospects of being hanged for mutiny. Strachey continues, quote, "The prisoner was brought forth in manacles, and both accused and suffered to make at large, to every particular, his answer, which he was only full of sorrow and tears, pleading simplicity and denial. But he being only found at this time, both the captain and the follower of his mutiny, and generally held worthy to satisfy the punishment of his offense with the sacrifice of his life, our governor passed the sentence of a martial court upon him, such as belongs to mutiny and rebellion. But so penitent he was, and he made so much moan alleging the ruin of his wife and children in this his trespass, as it wrought in the hearts of all the better sorts of the company, who therefore with humble entreaties and earnest supplications went unto our governor, whom they besought, and likewise did Captain Newport and myself, and never left him until we had gotten his pardon." So Stephen just barely escapes death yet again. And while it seems inordinately harsh to think that after all that they had been through as a group, a man might be hung for not wanting to go to Jamestown, but it's important to remember that Stephen was there on a contract of indentured servitude. His expenses thus far were being covered, and his stipend is being paid to his wife back home. So if he's not pulling his weight, he's just dead weight. And mutiny is a constant cloud over every ship at sea. It's historically dealt with harshly. But nonetheless, Stephen was pardoned. His cries that his family would be ruined if he were put to death, they resonated, and his friend saved his life. Of course, it's not hard to blame Stephen for wanting to abandon Jamestown. So far, the voyage had been a complete disaster, and they had no news as to the current state of the colony. They had no word on the fate of the other ships in the original flotilla. Had they made it? Had they resupplied Jamestown? Nobody knew. And so after a few months, the new ships ordered by Governor Gates were finished, and they were dubbed the Deliverance and the Patience. And after nearly a year on the Isle of Devils, they were ready to leave paradise. The Deliverance and the Patience arrived in Jamestown on May 24th, 1610, and what they found was nothing short of hell on earth. The past winter of Jamestown, the winter that Stephen and his men spent in paradise, is known in history as the Starving Time. Just a few months earlier, after being resupplied with men and provisions, the colony had a population of 500 people. Many of these men had arrived with the lost flotilla, but now there were less than 50 survivors. 90% of the colony had died over the winter. There was no food, no water. They had eaten their horses. They had eaten the dogs. And cannibalism. It's hard for me to even say the word. Cannibalism. The extent that hunger can drive a person is almost impossible to comprehend. When I think of hell, I think of people eating each other. There are first-hand accounts of graves being dug up and corpses being harvested for food. One man killed his pregnant wife, salted her meat, and ate her. Cannibalism is one of those awful human experiences that shows up in history every now and again. And I don't mean the tribal, ritualistic sort of cannibalism, but cannibalism as it exists in the modern, industrialized psyche. It's one of the most awful things you could possibly imagine. And it only happens in the most awful circumstances imaginable. Using history as a judge, it's nearly guaranteed that during times of extreme hunger, a certain percentage of people will resort to murder and cannibalism to avoid death. Most, I think, I'd like to put myself in this category, will accept death first, but not all. And so I wonder about this man who killed his pregnant wife. He probably never thought he could be driven to such a madness, but in the end he was. Which makes me wonder, how many potential cannibals do we meet every day? But I digress. You might wonder why there's still anyone even occupying this little triangle of hell. William Strachey answers that for us. He says, quote, "The palisades torn down, the ports open, the gates off the hinges, and empty houses rent up and burnt. Rather than the dwellers would step into the woods, a stone's cast off to fetch other firewood. The Indians killed as fast, if our men but stirred beyond the bounds of their blockhouse, as famine and pestilence did." End quote. 14,000 arrowheads pointed at Jamestown. Stay inside, you die. Walk out there, and you die. Stephen Hopkins and his company looked on at the wretched disaster that was Jamestown and calculated their own rations, and to the surprise of no one, they deemed Jamestown unviable and lost. So they loaded up what remained of the survivors onto the Patience and the Deliverance, and they landed on an island off the coast of Virginia to decide what the next step would be in their journey. But as fortunes would have it, a fourth company arrived, and it arrived brimming with men and supplies. The Jamestown survivors record this day as the Day of Providence. So the group returned to Jamestown, and they began reconstructing the colony. One of the men with them, a man named John Rolfe, who was a shipmate of Stephen Hopkins aboard the Sea Venture, he played a particularly important role moving forward in the colony. You see, he carried with him Spanish tobacco seeds that were destined to flourish in the humid Chesapeake environment. But more importantly, he did what the previous inhabitants could not do. He was able to befriend the local chief of the Powhatans, and soon the chief's own daughter would marry John Rolfe, convert to Christianity, and take the Christian name Rebecca, but her native name was Pocahontas. John Rolfe's tobacco crop took off like wildfire, finally securing a viable export and bringing the colony back from the brink. And the returns to the impatient investors of the London Company, they were finally able to get money back out of their colony. And back to Stephen Hopkins, while he was busily fulfilling his agreement of indentured servitude in Jamestown, his story, and the story of the Sea Venture, makes its way back to England and apparently inspires Shakespeare to write what may have been his last work, The Tempest, which is a play about a shipwrecked crew that lands on a remote island. There's even a mutinous little drunkard named Stefano, who should sound familiar to us. Anyway, it's presumed that Stephen Hopkins fulfills his servitude over the next few years, and he returns to England around 1614 or thereabouts, but it's hard to pin down exactly when. We do know that when he returns, his worst fears are realized. His wife, Mary Hopkins, was dead. She died in 1613. And while Stephen was lost at sea, he apparently was presumed dead. So his estate was liquidated, and his children were under the care of the local church. You can imagine that after all Stephen had been through, this must have felt like the world was ripped from his soul. I would imagine the only glimmer of hope and the only thought that kept him from jumping off a bridge were his children. Stephen was able to reunite with his children. He also remarries to a woman named Elizabeth Fitcher, who turns out to be a remarkable woman in her own right. Stephen also found new employment as a tanner, and he begins to rebuild his life in London. In 1618, Stephen and Elizabeth, they have a daughter together. Now, history is a funny thing. Time after time, it places people in those types of situations where all you can say is, what are the chances? What are the odds? And this is one of those moments. Stephen's growing family had some troublesome neighbors living next door. They were a couple of guys who had been excommunicated from the Church of England for some rather radical views. They were in fact leaders of an entire congregation that had fled to Holland to avoid persecution in an attempt to live among the more religious tolerant Dutch. But as they were still foreigners and immigrants, upward economic mobility was close to impossible. So Stephen Hopkins' neighbors had a solution for finding a permanent home for their little congregation. The solution involved investors, and the investors would finance a voyage. The voyage would take the little congregation to their own piece of paradise in the New World. And they just so happened to know somebody who has some New World experience. I don't know how they convinced him to do it, but in the end, Stephen decided to join these religious outcasts as an expert advisor, and this time, his family was coming with him. So to go back to my preferred metaphor, a man who had just survived a catastrophic visit to Mars, against all odds, he was going to do it again. But it makes me wonder what is motivating him. And parsing through this history, we have a lot of facts, but we can't get into Stephen's head. And he seems like a reasonably intelligent person, but for some reason, he decided that life would be better somewhere else, not in London. The original plan from the congregation was to set sail in the spring and to leave as much time as possible to prepare for winter. But Murphy's Law ruled and the delays began to pile up, and on top of that, there were contractual issues that legally left the congregation as de facto slaves for the next 7 years to the investors, depriving them of even owning their own homes and condemning them to 7 days of labor a week without any days for rest. Nonetheless, they pressed forward and secured 2 ships for their voyage. One ship, the Speedwell, carried the congregation from Holland that was to rendezvous with the other ship in England that was carrying a group of merchant adventurers. Very different than the religious radicals from Holland. But either way, they all sought a new life for their own reasons. However, as soon as the Speedwell launched, problems were afoot, and leak after leak made it clear that the ship would never survive a cross-Atlantic voyage, and the vessel was abandoned. Some of the congregation speculated that the captain himself was sabotaging his own vessel to avoid the horrors that were rumored to be awaiting anybody who traveled to the New World. Not sure I blame him. The congregation was now to climb aboard the ship that carried the merchant adventurers, but it was getting dangerously overcrowded, and it could only take on 35 of them. The rest had to return to Holland. So now these excommunicated religious radicals seeking to build a new world found themselves outnumbered 2-1, not including the ship's crew. But that's the way it was meant to be. And on September 6th, 1620, Stephen Hopkins and his family set sail for the northern tip of Virginia aboard a little ship called the Mayflower. If there's anybody listening to this who happens to be pregnant, you may be able to sympathize here with Stephen's wife, Elizabeth Hopkins. When the voyage of the Mayflower began, she was with child, and the waves were constantly crashing against the hull, rocking the ship back and forth incessantly. Talk about morning sickness. On top of that, the travelers' quarters were below deck in the dark. There were no formal bedrooms or beds. There really wasn't any privacy of any kind. People just sort of slept wherever they could. And as time drew on, many began experiencing the symptoms of scurvy, which comes from the lack of vitamin C. Their gums would bleed and their teeth would fall out. At one point, the ship's main support beam cracked during a storm, putting the entire ship at risk. Fortunately, the congregation had brought a giant screwjack to assist with home building, which was now used to support the beam and keep the ship from falling apart. During this luxury cruise, Elizabeth Hopkins, she goes into labor, and she gives birth to Stephen's 5th child, a son, who they aptly name Oceanus. So after 66 days at sea, they sight land and they drop anchor, but there's a problem. They were way far north of their destination and outside the jurisdiction of Virginia. And as my main source for this information puts it, Stephen once again found himself on a ship which had reached an unintended destination. Most of the congregation saw this as a violation of their agreement. They were concerned that they did not have the legal authority to settle in a foreign territory. Others made the argument that if they settled there, they would be free to do as they please, unharassed by the old world powers. And true to form, Stephen Hopkins, he wanted to settle right where they were. For his part, the disagreement was beginning to border once again on mutiny, but the decision, fortunately, was ultimately settled by the captain of the Mayflower, who refused to lift anchor, and basically said his ship was not moving anywhere. Future governor of the colony, William Bradford, wrote of these non-members of the congregation, who they called strangers, quote-unquote, and how they were eager to operate outside the agreement of the Virginia Company. He says, quote, "Ye discontented and mutinous speeches that some of the strangers amongst them had let fall from them in ye ship, that when they came ashore they would use their own liberty, for none had the power to command them, the patent they had being for Virginia and not for New England, which belonged to another government. with which ye Virginia Company had nothing to do, and partly that such an act by them done, this their condition considered, might be as firm as any patent, and in some respects more sure." End quote. So these pilgrims, who were in a sense fleeing persecution from England, they had set sail and braved death at sea to establish a society that would uphold their values. They were now faced with the prospects of losing total control of their destiny. They were operating outside of their mandate, outside of the Virginia territory, and the laws of the king were completely nullified in this situation. It's a staggering moment in history when you think about it. The future is wide open from here. The two groups, the strangers and the pilgrims, they held a meeting aboard the Mayflower, and they decided to draft a document that would bind everybody aboard to a single concept of law. Every male of age signed the document, Stephen Hopkins included, and it came to be known as the Mayflower Compact, and it reads as follows: "We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony of the northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. And by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers, from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have underto subscribed our names at Cape Cod the 11th of November, in the reign of our sovereign Lord King James, of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, the 54th, Anno Domini 1620. End quote. So, with an agreed-upon, albeit crude, system of laws behind them, they could now look towards choosing a place to settle. Captain Miles Standish, who the Pilgrims had hired as their military advisor, was ready to lead a party to launch from the Mayflower on a longboat and land upon the shores in search of a suitable location to start building their new life. He chose 16 men, among them was Stephen Hopkins, and they armed themselves with swords and muskets and made their way to land. William Bradford writes of some of the men's reactions when they first set foot on terra firma. He says, quote, "Being thus arrived in good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees, blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious oceans, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element." End quote. These guys made several incursions into the area before finally settling on a location. During some of these, they were attacked by Indians, and arrows and muskets exchanged fire, but nobody was injured. At one point, Stephen made a discovery that led to something of a cartoonish event. This is from a journal being kept by the Pilgrims. Quote, "In the morning we took our kettle and sunk it into the pond and trimmed our musket, for a few of them would go off because of the wet, and so coasted the wood again to come home, in which we were shrewdly puzzled and lost our way. As we wandered, we came to a tree where a young sprit was bowed down over and some acorns strewn underneath. Stephen Hopkins said it had been to catch some deer. So as we were looking at it, William Bradford being in the rear, he came up and also looked upon it. And as he went about it, it gave a sudden jerk up, and he was immediately caught up by the leg. It was a very pretty device, made with a rope of their own making, and having a noose as artificially made as any roper in England can make, and as like ours can be, which we brought away with us." I love that story. On December 16th, construction began. The men worked tirelessly in the frigid conditions, and they started with a common house. They moved to the family homes, defensive walls, and cannon positions, but nothing was ready to be inhabited yet. So the women and children, they had to continue to live aboard the Mayflower this whole time, for this whole winter, while all this construction was going on. And you can imagine the condition of the Mayflower at this point. Just imagine the smell alone. You've sailed aboard it for 66 days at sea, and you've reached not the correct destination, but at least it's some destination, and you're still there. You're waiting for the village to be built, and you're waiting for winter to be over. And to make matters worse, exasperated by malnutrition and the damp, cold conditions, disease was beginning to take hold. William Bradford recounts the situation. Quote, "In 2 or 3 months' time, half the company died, especially in January and February, being in the depth of winter, and wanting houses and other comforts, being infected with scurvy and other diseases which this long voyage had brought upon them, so as there died sometimes 2 or 3 a day, Of 100-odd persons, scarce 50 remained, and of these, in the time of most distress, there was but 6 or 7 sound persons, who to their great commendation spared no pains day or night, but with abundance of toil and hazard, to their own health, fetched them wood, made them fires, dressed them meat, made their beds, washed their loathsome clothes, clothed and unclothed them." End quote. Of the women in the colony, only 4 survived. Stephen Hopkins' wife, Elizabeth, was one of them, along with the rest of the Hopkins family. They all survived. And as the cold, dark months of winter ebbed into spring, the health of the survivors increased with the temperatures. Even though half the colony perished, it was still far greater than Jamestown. The mere fact of their survival was enough providence for them to give them hope. And that spring, when the Mayflower departed for England, not a single pilgrim went with it. William Bradford paints an eloquent picture of the pilgrim mindset coming out of that brutal winter. He says, quote, "May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, our fathers were Englishmen, which came over this great ocean, and were ready to perish in this wilderness. But they cried unto the Lord, and he heard their voices, and looked upon their adversity." End quote. Plymouth was now their home, but they weren't alone. They had seen Indians from afar, observing them many times before, but contact had never really been made. That is, until one of the Indians boldly walked into the little settlement and began speaking English to them. I'll again return to my Mars scenario. Let's say one of those aliens that, again, on a good day will leave you alone, but on a bad day might annihilate your entire village. One of them, as wild as a pack of wolves, bids you welcome in your own language. I bet you could hear a pin drop in Plymouth at that moment. This man's name was Samoset, and he tells the pilgrims that they are building on land that used to belong to another tribe that has since died off due to disease brought on by the English. But there is a lone survivor. His name is Squanto, and he's coming to visit. And oh, by the way, he also speaks perfect English. Squanto was apparently kidnapped by English slave traders years earlier, and he was now making his way back to his homeland. Samoset and Squanto, on their respective visits, both stayed at the Hopkins residence. And since Stephen had more dealings with the Indians than any other resident of Plymouth, his home becomes something of an embassy for the Indians amongst the colonists. The chief of the Wampanoag tribe, his name is Massasoit, and the governor of Plymouth sits down with him and signs a peace treaty in Stephen's house. There they agree to aid each other in provisions and defense, and for better or worse, they remained on friendly terms for the next 50 years. Stephen Hopkins was even invited to spend a few evenings in Chief Massasoit's home. Once the weather broke in the spring, the planting of crops began in Plymouth, and with the help of the Wampanoag, they learned the tricks of planting in the local soil. They learn the lay of the land, and they learn where the fish are, and they learn where to hunt. So the friendship's paying off. For the first time in almost a year, the fear of starving to death was gone. And when fall came, and the harvest gave the pilgrims its yield, it was more than they could have hoped for. They had enough to survive the next winter, and then some. And so it was decided that they would have a little celebration to thank God for their good fortunes. They invited their friends, their indispensable friends, Chief Massasoit and the Wampanoag tribe. The 4 women who survived the previous terrible winter aboard the Mayflower, Eleanor Billington, Mary Brewster, Susanna White, and Elizabeth Hopkins, they took charge of the event, and they made sure that there was plenty of food to go around. It makes me a little emotional to think of these women. Women, it seems, just have a natural instinct to want to help people. They want everyone to be warm and well fed. And for them to now have the means to feed their families, I imagine they must have felt a great sense of pride in cooking this meal. Edward Winslow describes the overflowing bounty in a letter he wrote. He says, quote, "Our corn did prove well, and God be praised, we had good increase of Indian corn, and our barley indifferent good. But our peas not worth the gathering, for we feared they were too late sown. They came up very well and blossomed, but the sun parched them in the blossom. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on a fowling, so that we might, after a more special manner, rejoice together. After we had gathered the fruit of our labors, they 4 in one day killed as much fowl, as with little help besides, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, of whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and then went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation, and bestowed upon our governor, and upon our captain, and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want, that we often wished you partakers of our plenty." End quote. And with that, we not only have the finale of the life and trials of Stephen Hopkins, but we also have the story of the first Thanksgiving. So for obvious reasons, I was really tempted to call that episode There and Back Again, A Pilgrim's Tale, but it didn't quite fit the mood of topics such as cannibalism and starvation. There's actually quite a bit more to the Stephen Hopkins story, that elements of his life that didn't really make it into the scope and narrative that we had here. But he actually ended up opening an inn and a tavern when he settled in Plymouth. And as we know, he was not a strict observer of the Puritan-style laws enforced by the Pilgrims. And so when people were looking for a place to get drunk, especially on the Sabbath, they would go there, which often landed him in court. And so it's interesting when you search through the court documents of Plymouth, his name is on there quite a bit. And if you're interested in learning anything else or doing further research on that, I'll post a PDF. I did it with the last episode too, and I'll probably just make this a regular thing. I'll post a PDF of my research notes of where I pull all the information from, and there's links to all over the internet where you can find more information on any of our subjects. As with the previous episodes, I hope you enjoyed its telling. I hope I did justice to its characters. I always try to. If you could, I'd appreciate you following on Facebook or subscribing on Apple Podcasts or one of the various other podcast sites. I think I've uploaded to them all. You can also get the episodes emailed to you via the show's website, thickerthanbloodhistory.com. And if you could be so kind as to leave a review, especially on Apple Podcasts, that really helps the exposure for this little history podcast that I call Thicker Than Blood History.